Hello, welcome again. In this channel we discuss heathenry of the Old Saxon people, and in the Old Saxon writings, Saxon heathenry is called Aldsidu, which means old ways or old customs. And we also discuss the heathenry of other Germanic tribes. We're always discussing the old ways, not modern heathenry. We don't discuss modern Wicca here. But today we're going to discuss the Massacre of Verden and forced Christianization. And let me give a disclaimer up front. The goal of this channel is not to preach hatred of Christianity. But if you study history at all, the victors write the history. And in the past, not many history books called the genocide of the Native Americans for what it was, and not many history books really downplayed the atrocity of slavery in America. We've come a long way, but often the history books of Europe are written through Christian eyes, and now that the world is far more secular in many ways than it is Christian, it's time to relook at some of history here and to look at it, because there are two sides of every story. And we're not here to preach hatred of Christianity, but unfortunately most of Europe was forced into Christianity with the sword, and it was a very ugly point of history, and a lot of the history books skip over this. So we don't want to teach hatred of Christianity. We want to teach heathen history here. So let's not hate the Christians for the sake of hating the Christians. But let's discuss history as it was so that we don't repeat it. We want to teach the ugliness of history so that we don't repeat it. So the Massacre of Verden. So, this is something of the Old Saxons. If we were to agree with the early history books like Bede or Bede, that the Angles and some Saxons went to England. England is named after the Angles, and Old English was spoken in England, but Old Saxon was spoken in Saxony, and Old English and Old Saxon are two different languages. So, this is the Massacre of Verden, which happened in Saxony, not England. England was already Christian in 782 when the Massacre of Verden happened, but the Saxons in Saxony at this time were still heathen. And the Saxons in Saxony spoke Old Saxon. They did not have kings. They lived under a thingdom. And they did have clan leaders and leaders of the Gows and Drotens. But Verden is right here in the center of Saxony, and this is where the massacre took place on the Aller River. Now, in 1935, Germany assembled the Saxon Heli, and in Old Saxon that would be Saxony. They assembled this in 1935. They put up 4,500 large stones in Verden to commemorate the Massacre of Verden. And the site is open to the public today. This is me by one of the stones. So that is what I look like. So some of these stones are larger than others, but 4,500 large stones were put out in the Saxon Heli, or the Saxon Grove. And to understand the Massacre of Verden, we first have discussed forced Christianization in the Saxon Wars. Wikipedia has a good article on the Saxon Wars. I don't think Wikipedia is the best source in the world, but sometimes it has some good articles. And its article on the Saxon Wars I do think is pretty good and well documented and footnoted. But the Saxon Wars happened in the year 772 through 804, and the Massacre of Verden happened 13 years into the Saxon Wars. So the Saxon Wars were a 33-year war. I really don't like the title. I almost think we should call it the Frankish Wars, because it was the Franks attacking the Saxons. In 497 AD, Clovis, who is the king of the Franks, converted to Christianity. And I don't believe all of the Franks converted right away. I do think that it took time for all the Franks to accept Christianity. But certainly all the Franks were Christians for at least 200 years before the start of the Saxon Wars. And the Franks ruled pretty much most of Europe. They were the strongest military force in Europe. They conquered all of Europe. And they forced the Germanic tribes who were not Christian, like the Franks were a Germanic tribe, but they were the first to accept Christianity, and they forced the other Germanic tribes into Christianity. And in the Saxon Wars, it started in the year 772 when the Franks first attacked the Irminsul and Thunar's well site. I'm not talking about Thunar's oak. The Franks destroyed Thunar's oak of the Chatti as well, but Thunar's well and the Irminsul were two holy sites of the Saxon people in Hohenseeberg and Eresburg. And the Saxons were attacked in 772 AD, and both these holy sites were destroyed right at the outset of the war. So it was a religious battle right from the outset, and the Franks were content on forced conversion. And I can't iterate enough that it was the Christians who left us the historical sources. And while a lot of people will say, see, we can't trust the sources, especially as heathens, because the Christians left us these sources, I'm going to come back and say, these sources show how awful the Christians were, and actually sheds a bad light on them, because while the Christians wrote these things down, they admit to their genocide and their, from a modern standpoint, war crimes in it. For example, in the year 775, in the Royal Frankish Annals, written during these wars, the Frankish Annals list the history of all of the years of Charlemagne's reign. And the entry of Charlemagne for the year 775 is Charlemagne sits down, he spends, I'm going to read it, while the king, Karl the Grosse, or Charlemagne, Karl the Great, spent the winter at the villa of Quisri, he decided to attack the treacherous and treaty-breaking tribe of the Saxons and to persist in this war until they were either defeated and forced to accept the Christian religion or be entirely exterminated. Now, basically, to understand this quote, you have to go back to 772. Charlemagne won some wars early on against the Saxons, some battles, and he forced them to be baptized. He led forced baptisms, and as soon as Charlemagne left Saxony to go empire whoring in Spain, because he was trying to conquer all of Spain for the church, and remember, a lot of Spain at the time was Muslim. Charlemagne's grandfather, Karl Martel, defeated the Muslims because, really at this time in history, it was up in the air. Was Europe going to be Christian? Was it going to be Muslim? Or would heathenry prevail? So, the church was invested in Charlemagne. That's why the church, the Pope, crowned Charlemagne Kaiser or Caesar. And, the Charlemagne and the Franks were the military wing of the church. And really, Charlemagne bossed the Pope around. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. You have the military, you really have the power. But the Pope was getting something in return for making Charlemagne Kaiser. He got Charlemagne to conquer Europe in the name of Christ, in the name of the church. So Charlemagne was the political head of Europe, but the Pope was the spiritual head. So nonetheless, Charlemagne, he conquers parts of Saxony. He then leaves to go empire whoring elsewhere, because that's what Charlemagne, he does what other conquerors do. He's trying to enlarge his territory as large as he can. And as soon as Charlemagne and his armies leave Saxony, though he left some army there, the Saxons rose up, overthrew the forces who were there, and, broke the treaty. And that's why Charlemagne is like, I'm sick of these bastards. They made a treaty. They swore oaths, of course, with the sword at their throat. And a forced oath, it would not be considered an oath in modern times because it's made under duress. Legal contracts in our modern world aren't binding if they're made under duress. And you can't fault people for, I'm going to take your head, or you can convert. And they chose to keep their heads, and they did the forced baptism, and they went home saying, what a stupid and ugly religion this thing is. Foreign madness is what they looked at Christianity as. And, Charlemagne's own court annals state that, he has two things in mind. Either they're going to be defeated and forced to accept Christianity, or they're going to be entirely exterminated. And there's many times that he's committing mass deportations. We have 4 different times in 4 different years he deports over 10,000 Saxons to force them by breaking them up to be Christian. So, so if I can go on and explain the Saxon Wars each year, but I'm going to summarize because I want to focus on the Massacre of Verden. And you have to understand in the context of the Saxon Wars. But in the year 782, Charlemagne again was in Spain empire whoring, and he sent a large part of his army to march through Saxony to then go attack Saxon neighbors, the Sorbs, who were Slavic pagans, and the Saxons didn't appreciate that either. The Saxons were annoyed that Thor's Oak of the Chatty was destroyed, and they tried to retake that when Charlemagne was away empire whoring. They retook their site of the Irminsul when Charlemagne was away empire whoring in Italy and Spain, enlarging his kingdom. And when he sent an army through Saxony to attack the pagan Slavs and the Sorbs, his army was attacked. Charlemagne wasn't with that army, but nonetheless, after forced conversion, which is not forced conversion, the Saxons decided to continue practicing their native heathenry. They took up arms to defend their homeland, and they attacked. And I don't think that what the Saxons did was wrong. I mean, if America was conquered by a Muslim army and we were forced at sword point or gun point, to use modern terms, we can no longer celebrate Thanksgiving and Christmas, but we must keep Ramadan holy. We want, as Americans, to be free. We don't want foreigners to rule us, and we don't want foreigners to force us into another religion. So as soon as this army comes through, Wittikind, the most famous Saxon heathen and leader of the Heathen Saxons, he's fighting to keep Saxony heathen. He has his men use guerrilla warfare, and they attack Charlemagne's camp. So his army is actually split in two parts in Saxony. One's in a camp and the other one is out patrolling. So he then attacks the camp. He wipes out the camp. And those on horseback, his cavalry that was out patrolling, he then lures towards the Suntel Mountain where the Saxons have the height. They use their arrows, they shoot the arrows down, they pretty much wipe out the cavalry. Wittikind, the heathen Saxon, almost completely, him and his heathen forces, almost completely annihilated that entire army. Very few escaped, and they naturally went running to Charlemagne. So that happened the year 782, and then what was Charlemagne's response? Well, Charlemagne's own royal Frankish annals, written by Charlemagne and his court, state when the king heard of this disaster, he decided not to delay, but he made haste to gather an army, and he marched into Saxony. He called to his presence the chiefs of the Saxons and inquired who induced people to rebel. So let me pause right there. Wittikind was a hero because he was the only noble that gave the finger to Charlemagne. When Charlemagne came into Saxony, most of the nobles are like, listen, the Frankish armies are all of Europe. Like all the Europeans are becoming united behind the church and they're attacking us. I wish the Germans had that attitude, at least in the First World War. You can't take on the entire world. Hitler had that attitude, but of course he's an awful person, and thank goodness that they lost that war, but you can't take on the world, and the Saxon nobles realized that. So outside of Wittikind, all of the nobles sided with Charlemagne, accepted his bribes, took positions of power, and tried to enforce Christianity on 99% of the non-noble Saxon populace who wanted no part of it. And Wittikind was the one noble that said, screw that, I'm not doing that. The other nobles took his land, so Wittikind lost everything, but he didn't care. His goal was to have a free heathen Saxony, and he was going to fight for the lower classes and to keep them heathen, and that's why the lower classes rose up with him. And nonetheless, when Charlemagne called all the chiefs of the Saxons and he inquired who induced the people to rebel, they all said, well, this is Wittikind. He's the author of this treason, because keep in mind, from Charlemagne's perspective, well, I've conquered Saxony a few times. Every time I leave it, it rises up again. So in his mind, it's treason. But in the Saxons' mind, they're defending their homeland from a foreign occupier. So, again, this is why I get mad at modern history books, because, they're still written through Christianize. Even the agnostic teachers still see things to Christianize because all the sources that survived are Christian, and you really need to look at both sides. And it's not that hard to figure out what's going on here. I mean, You have Christian armies coming in, forcing Christianity. We have writings like Saxon capitularies and the Lex Saxonum, where the Saxons were put to death if they ate meat during Lent. They had to take one out of every 60 of their people and donate them to church as a tithe to be a slave. So they had to give some of their children to the church as slaves. If they were caught doing anything heathen or celebrating heathen holy days, they were put to death. So, I can put all these quotes from the 700s and 800s up on the screen right now and prove how nasty it was. We have overwhelming literary evidence of this forced Christianization process. I think I should do a future video on the Lex Saxonum, and we'll just read it and just see how asinine and hateful that these laws were. Imagine again if America was conquered by a Muslim army and we were forced, some of our family members get caught celebrating Thanksgiving and taking that Thursday off and are publicly put to death for it. We would be bitter. We would be pissed. We would not accept that. And you have to understand that these Saxons, they felt that they were really violated. So they all declared that Wittikind was the author of the treason. They said they couldn't produce him because he fled to Normania. And that's what happened often with most of the Saxon nobility being traitors to their own people and only one Saxon noble remaining true to a heathen Saxony. He fled to Denmark because Denmark shared the same heathenry that the Saxons did. They all venerated the Aesir. And Siegfried and Godfried, Siegfried was the king until he died, then his son Godfried took over as king. They accepted the Saxon heathen fugitives all the time because in their mind, these are heathens and the Christians to the south of them are crazy. And the Danes started building a large wall, a very large Danish wall in the southern part of Denmark, a huge wall, because they were scared to death that after Saxony fell, their borders were next. And they were right. The Christian armies wanted to take out the Danes as well. But then the quote continues, but others who had carried out his will and committed the crime they delivered to the king, the number of 4,500. In the king's command, they were all beheaded in one day upon the river Aller at a place called Verden. So remember in German, V's are pronounced like an F. So I say Verden with an F, even though you see the V there. So 4,500 were beheaded, and I probably should have underlined beheaded here. They were beheaded in one day. Now, here's another shot, a picture that I took myself. If you walk through the Sassenhain today, you see 4,500 stones and you walk through all of them. It's a very nice site. You can see, here's a sign that I took a picture of, which shows how, it was originally set up. It is a part of a Lutheran church. So today, and actually the sign, because it's Germany, it's in German. So, it talks about the Sachsenhain in several spots. It's a nice site, but it's about 3 kilometers from the Aller River. So I don't believe that it's the site that the massacre actually took place. It's where, Germans, Hitler and his cronies gassed in 1935. And here's a picture of my son. To his left or to the right, there's a volleyball net. So the youth play sports in the area today. And again, there's a path that you walk. It's very peaceful. It's very nice, but it is a Christian center today. Now, the church in the 1700s, because when the Enlightenment happened, a lot of German people who were reading their history books started to question. The Protestant Reformation was going on, so you have a divide between North and Southern Germany. And honestly, since, the Franks are, in Central and Southern Germany and Belgium, that's where the Frankish tribes were. I really believe this hatred continued in the Protestant Reformation because Northern Germany is almost entirely Lutheran and Southern and Central Germany is almost entirely Catholic. So, I don't think it's an accident that the Frankish areas and other areas of Germany that converted early with the Franks are Catholic today, and the Northern part, even though the Protestant Reformation happened like 900 years after the Saxon Wars, the hatred kind of, this sort of hatred takes a long time to subside. But I do want to discuss two other aspects of the Massacre of Verden, because there were Catholics over the years that said Charlemagne didn't behead 4,500 people. He was a nice Christian man. Again, when the Christians write the history books, they then go back and say, "Now wait a minute, the church wasn't that bad as they recorded it." And then a lot of other Germans were like, "Well, yeah, it was." And today, Charlemagne is famous for being the butcher of the Saxons. But he also was the man who forced many of the Germanic tribes into Christianity, and he was hailed as a hero by the church. But there are two pieces of evidence that I think really prove that the Massacre of Verden happened outside of the Frankish writings that claim that they did it. One is the blood cord of Constat, and one is an Old Saxon source. The Old Saxon Hellion alludes to the Massacre of Verden in its pages. And I bring these up mainly because, the scholars, even if the university scholars are agnostics or atheists today, they still read things through Christian eyes. They still were raised in a Christian world. And, I know my German family well. I was born in America and my grandparents came here, but the rest of their family stayed. My cousins, my aunts, my uncles, I guess we would call them second and third cousins in Germany today, but I guess the technical term is probably first cousin, twice removed or once removed or whatever. But, my family raised in Germany today, I know when they're having holy days. So, they have the day off work on Ascension days. 40 days after Easter, they all have off work. My family has complained to me that they have a church tax and there's no separation of church and state because most of my family are not Christians. They're not heathens either. My household is heathen. My wife is heathen. Our 4 children in our house are heathen. I have an aunt that's a heathen. But the rest of the family are a bunch of agnostics, and they don't like the church, and they have Christian holy days that Germany celebrates. They have the church tax that is just garnished from their paycheck, unless they get out of it. And one of my aunts and one of my uncles have actually gotten out of the church tax because there's no separation of church and state yet in Germany, which is sad. That's one good thing about being an American. But nonetheless, let's discuss the Massacre of Constat. There are 3 historical sources of the Massacre of Constat, and this is when the Alemanni were conquered. And remember, the Saxons were not the only heathen tribe conquered. Thor's Oak of the Chatti was also destroyed by the Frankish armies, and the Alemanni were crushed too, and the Alemanni were crushed with the blood cord of Constat. And that took place in the year 746 when Charlemagne, a Frankish king, and Charlemagne's uncle, he invited all the nobles of the Alemanni to a council. And then he ambushed them, and he basically executed several thousand nobles. This is what the historical sources say. Now, several thousand is a loose term. Was it 2,000? Was it 8,000? But nonetheless, no historian questions the historicity of the Massacre of Constat. They all debate the numbers. But this was very common in Frankish writings. This is how the Franks did things. They did not like the Alemanni being heathens. They were going to bring them into the church. But more so, Charlemagne wasn't just doing it to bring people into the church. I mean, that's his rallying cry to get his people behind him. But in the end, Charlemagne is just another conqueror that's trying to have his own ambition and enlarge his own empire. And the Franks before Charlemagne, like his uncle Carloman and his brother Pepin, they were, enlarging the Frankish empire for their own greed. But, after the massacre of the Alemanni, after the blood cord of Constat, the Alemannia was ruled by the Franks, and they never recovered. And the Saxons had a hard time recovering after the massacre of Verden. So because the blood cord of Constat happened, I really do believe that the massacre of Verden happened. And again, the Franks always attacked the Christians or the heathen sites first. They had to destroy Thor's Oak. And when they went to Saxony, they begin the war by attacking first Thor's Well in Hohenseeberg, and then they attack the Irminsul. That's the first 2 sites that they attack. It's pretty much coming in and saying, F you heathen gods, Christ rules, haha. That's what they're doing. So it is a religious war. Now, I really struggle with the Christian mindset of many scholars. I mean, there are two sides of the story, and I'm proud that as a heathen, I read history books as a heathen. Now, I can't be as biased as the Christian scholars are, but you know, I've never seen Matthias Springer in his book Die Sachsen. None of the German scholars, you know, link the blood court of Kronstadt with the Massacre of Verden, and none of them, you know, whether it's Father Murphy, whether it's Ermengarde Rausch, whether it's James Cathay, none of the Old Saxon scholars pick up that the Old Saxon Hellion is alluding to the Massacre of Verden. And I think it's because, you know, I mean, obviously Father Murphy's a Christian, but a lot of these agnostic scholars, they don't read the historical sources through heathen eyes, and we should read it through heathen eyes. We need to be aware of our biases, but you have to look at history through both sides. So I'm actually going to quote the Bible here. There is one verse in one of the four Gospels. You know, there's four Gospels. Just to explain it, you know, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But only Matthew has one sentence that discusses Herod killing all the babies in Bethlehem. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the Old Saxon Hellion is a gospel that praises the Saxons, and it retells the story of Christ as a Saxon religious hero. There's a helmet of invisibility, there's birds that land on shoulders, there's flying feather coats, which is Freyg's feather coat. She has a flying feather coat. Freya does too, but the old Saxons did not know Freya, they only knew Frigg. Helmet of invisibility most likely was Sosnos, the god of the Saxons, son of Woden, who the Saxons trace descent to. The Hellion changes lots of things. Like in the biblical Gospels, the disciples go to Christ and say, "Teach us to pray," as John the Baptist taught his disciples. But in the Old Saxon Hellion, they go to Christ and they don't say, "Teach us to pray," they say, "Teach us the runes." There's so many changes to the gospel, and one of the changes is Matthew 2:16. One sentence in four gospels discusses Herod killing all the children in Bethlehem. Because Matthew 2:16, it's one sentence. Herod realized he was deceived by the three wise men. He gets angry. He tells his soldiers to kill all the children of Bethlehem because he wants the baby Christ to be killed. Three kings come from the east and they want to worship the king of the Jews, and Herod's like, "I'm king." So, we have this verse that, he orders his soldiers to kill all the children that were in Bethlehem who were 2 years of age and younger, based on the time when the wise men told them they saw the star in the sky. One sentence in four Gospels. We're about to see 3 paragraphs in the Old Saxon Hellion go off. And let me tell you, it says here that he sent forth his soldiers just to kill the children. But remember, 4,500 people were beheaded in the Massacre of Verden. In the Old Saxon Hellion, babies are getting beheaded and not killed. And instead of one sentence in 4 Gospels, we have 3 paragraphs discussing how innocent these children were, comparing Herod, who's appointed by Caesar in Rome as a non-Jew to rule. Herod was an Idumean, not an Israelite. He's appointed by Caesar, or a Kaiser, to rule foreign people who had a completely different religion than the Romans. And they're comparing Charlemagne to Herod, and the Saxons to the Jews, because the Saxons are being ruled from Rome, just as Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor in Rome by the Pope, he comes in, he conquers Saxony. They're comparing the plight of the Israelites and the Saxons as poor people oppressed by idiots from Rome. And changing the story from just killing the children to beheading babies is very significant. Why? Because babies don't typically get beheaded. They're too small to be beheaded. You're going to sword the baby. You're going to behead an adult because an adult is large in size. But they're changing the story because it has to do with the Massacre of Verden. Now this is one slide. I'm going to show you 3 slides because this is my translation of the Old Saxon Hellion. The Old Saxon is on top. This is my own translation. But because, it's 3 paragraphs, I'm going to do it on 3 slides. But in the Hellion, it changes the 3 wise men to 3 foreign heroes, like Beowulf is a hero. So we have people from the east who use soothsaying. Sooth is an Old Saxon word that means truth, or using the arts to determine truth, as in what the truth is for the future. So you have these heroes from foreign lands who are using soothsaying and runes to determine the future, and they determine through them that there's going to be a star in the sky to show them where the king of the world is going to be born. And then these heroes, they come. Herod said those heroes scorned him, and he sat worried, and he was angry in his breast, and he said that he's able to get better counsel, thinking, now I can know his winter number. Now I'm going to pause right there. You know, in Saxony, you determine one's age by how many winters they lived. So if you're a baby that's born just before the start of winter, just a few full moons later, you're going to be considered 1 year old, even though it's like your third full moon of your life, because that's how the Saxons counted. Winter Yatalu, winter numbers, is how they counted their age. So Herod is saying, now I can know the person's age. Um, so now I may acquire how old he has become here in Middle Earth under this host. And he issued such a hard command, Herod over his Reich. He, the king of the people, told his young men and people to go. He told them go through with their hand strength, which is an old Saxon phrase for battle. If you have good hand strength, that means you're good with an arrow, bow, or spear. An axe. Swords were pretty rare in Saxony, though they certainly existed. And we have them in museums, but those were the weapons of the nobility. Most Saxons were arrows and spear thrusters. But then he says, use your hand strength to seize the heads of the children. And the old Saxon word, putting in modern Latin letters, because we use our Latin letters today instead of runes, which is unfortunate. I wish we used runes every day for our writing. But hovdu benamen, which, Namen means to take. So if you read Old Norse, land namabuch, nama is your word to take. So land taking book. So they're seizing heads. You're taking heads. So that really means to behead. So why is the gospel story changed to beheading? And it's going on for 3 paragraphs. And you're going to seize the heads from as many children around Bethlehem, all who were born with at least 2 years of age. This crime, and it's called the crime, it was carried out, tionon, right here. This is the word for crime. It's carried out amongst all the kuningas. I translate this as kings. Remember, the Saxons don't have kings. A kuning, or a kin, is a family. And a kinning is, or which our modern word king come from, is a family leader, not a king in the sense of a Kaiser. Because the Saxons didn't have kings. They had clan leaders, but not a dictator ruling all of Saxony, like the Angles had in England. The Franks had kings. And really, kings, the Germanic tribes adopting kingship was their downfall. Because once the king accepted Christianity, like the first king of all Norway was Harald Fairhair, but as soon as his son becomes king of all Norway and his son was a Christian, then Christianity was enforced. And we have the saga of Hakon the Good, who enforces Christianity over all Norway. Then he even moved Yule from the full moon of Yule Manuther, or Yule moon, to be on the same time as Christ Mass. Which was then on the solstice on the Julian calendar of December the 25th. So, kingships really was a downfall of heathenry. Heathens were originally led by clan leaders. They didn't have kings ruling entire nations. The word king changed over time to be a family head to a nation head, which is 2 very different things. And then the Hellion goes on saying so many children died, and they all were this word right here. You have this word at the end, los, and this word is the word for sin right here, sundiono los, which means sin. So, these children are innocent, and yet they're killed, and it's kind of implying that 4,500 who were beheaded were probably innocent people. And that's my guess too. The Frankish annals want to say the 4,500 people that were caught, they were the ones who did the crime, but most likely the ones who did the crime fled to Denmark with Wittekind, and they just rounded up 4,500 and killed them. And The third slide. We're going to continue. The Hellion keeps going. There's never been such a regrettable death of young men, a wretched death. Women were weeping. Many mothers saw their sons killed. She was not able to console their young with their own two hands, which they held the lovely little child. The sons gave up their lives in front of their mothers. Those who did the evil work with the weapon's edge did not see evil punishment nor any evil shadow. Many mothers fell weeping due to the young child's murder. Mourning in Bethlehem, loud lamentation. Young children had their hearts cut in two with the sword. They could not be there would not be forever such a sad deed in this world. Many wives, brides in Bethlehem saw their children murdered before them, killed bloodily in their laps. The murderers killed an innocent crowd. Nothing is written about the men's work. They wished to kill the mighty Christ themselves, but the mighty God, from their hatred, moved them from there that night to Egypt. So really, that's when it stops right there. I mean, I had to take 3 slides to translate this whole thing, and we have only one sentence in Matthew. So why is the Hellion changing babies to being beheaded? Why is it turned into a long 3-paragraph rant? Because this is an allusion to the Massacre of Verden. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, because what else could it be? Why would the author of the Hellion, who's trying to convert the Saxons, change the biblical story that much? Well, nonetheless, if you like this video, please visit our website, www.aldsidu.com. We are 1,700 Saxon heathens strong, keeping Saxon heathenry going. Please visit my blog site, www.aldsidu.com/blog. I have about 80, 85, maybe 90 articles written. I even have an article written about this, so if you'd rather read it than hear it, please go there. And also like and subscribe. Thank you.